This is Lady B, and this last weekend, my family had a party. And on a whim, for that party, I decided to make a pie that I used to make all the time. The key word there being used to. I hadn't made it in more than 15 years. And somehow in my head, I thought, oh, it won't be a problem. I'll just do what I used to. Well, I was wrong. So now I'm bringing you a video I'm naming Tips and Mistakes to Avoid when Making a Pie. I hope you enjoy. The first thing I need to do to make this recipe is to make my crust. And this is my own recipe that I use specifically for both this pie and for when I make cheesecakes. And it's really easy to do. I have here 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Now this is a gluten-free, but you can use regular all-purpose. In fact, that's how I used to make it before I had to start making adjustments for family members that couldn't have gluten. To this, I need to add, and that was the first mistake I made. When making doughs for bread, it's always a good idea to hold out 1/2 cup of flour just in case your air is too dry and you end up with too much flour in your dough. Now, this is also true to a lesser degree for pie crusts like this. It's a good idea to hold back 1/4 to 1/2 cup of flour, which can then be used to flour the surface when you're rolling out your pie crust. This is especially important where I live because I live in a desert and the air is always dry here. And I didn't hold any out, so of course my pie crust mix ended up being way too dry. And that was when I ran into my first hurdle, which I utterly failed at. And 8 ounces of my fats. Now you can use 8 ounces of butter. I used to like to use a combination of lard and butter or margarine. These days this is a margarine baking stick. It's margarine specially formulated to be used in recipes like this. And for the margarine, you just cut it up into tablespoon cubes, sections, however you want to put it, and you put it in here. Now, in the past, if you do not have a food processor, you can do what I used to do in the past, which is I would do this in a bowl, and then I would use a fork or a pastry cutter on it to bring it together and crumble it. But these days, with food processors, you don't have to do that anymore. It's really nice and handy. So, doing it in the food processor, I put my margarine in like that. And now I'm just going to turn it on and I'm going to pulse it until it comes together and looks something like sand. And it does. It has this texture very similar to sand like you see in a sandbox. So now, the last thing I do is I add my liquids. Now, this is where it gets different. If you've seen one of my earlier videos, you'd know that I like to use a carbonated water rather than standard water in my pie crusts. It keeps it flaky and lets you roll it out more than once. Now, because of what I'm using this with, I'm not using carbonated water. I am using a non-alcoholic ginger beer. It does flavor the crust, and I love it for this particular recipe. You don't need to. If you don't like ginger like I do, just do straight carbonated water, or even a lemon lime if you like it. It will go well with the apple. But I have a 1/2 cup here, and I'm going to add this in, and then I'm going to pulse it again. Now what I need to do is I need to refrigerate my dough. Now again, if you're not using a gluten-free flour, you may just be able to roll it out right away. But gluten-free flours take longer to hydrate than other flours. Takes them longer to absorb the moisture. So because this is a gluten-free flour, I'm going to be pouring this out on here, rolling it up in my saran wrap, and then putting it in the fridge for 10 minutes. There we go. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, it's been 10 minutes, and I am starting to think that the air must be really dry right now, because this is a lot crumblier than usual. So the easy way to fix this is to literally just add a little more moisture. So I have here a cup, and I'm not going to pour, I'm just going to sprinkle. And this was exactly the wrong thing to do. Now, if you end up with too dry of a crust like I did here, and it's all crumbly and it's not coming together, the correct thing to do is to put it back in your food processor or your bowl or whatever. Do not handle it with your hands, and just slowly add 1 or 2 tablespoons of water, a little bit at a time, to incorporate it in while still trying your best not to melt your margarine or butter, and bring it to the correct consistency. I did not do this. Okay, it's time for the first layer. So I have set my oven to preheat at 350, and I need to peel and core 4 to 5 Granny Smith apples. Some of these are kind of small, so I've gone with 5. And that doesn't take very long to do. Now, in order to core them and slice them, when I'm doing this recipe, I use a technique I picked up online, where I cut it in half, and then I cut each half in quarter into another half again, so I have quarters. And then I'm going to put my apple sideways on my board, and I'm going to come in on an angle and just cut that middle out. And this provides me now with a flat space for which I can now slice my apple quite thin. And I do want it thin. When making an apple pie like this and pre-slicing it, it's a good idea to have some water on hand with a little bit of lemon in it that you can drop your apple slices into to keep them from browning before you cook them. Now, I had thought that I'd be working with them quickly enough it wouldn't be a problem, and I was wrong. Now, of course, this doesn't affect the final result, and the process of cooking it on the stove did take care of it, but I did have some browning starting to occur with my apples that could have been avoided if I had just taken that one simple extra step. I have finished slicing my apples, and now I need to assemble all the ingredients for my first layer in a medium-sized pot. And now I'm going to take this upstairs, and I'm going to, stirring occasionally, I will heat this on the stove until the apples become tender and the liquid thickens in it. So now that I have cooked my apples and added them into my pie crust, stop. When you are making a pie with a pre-cooked filling, always make sure to pre-bake your crust. Or, in the case like this where it's going in the oven anyway, partially bake it for 10 minutes before you put your filling in. By not pre-baking my pie crust for 10 minutes, my pie crust ended up undercooked, as you'll be able to see later. So now that I have cooked my apples and added them into my pie crust, I need to assemble layer 2. Now, this is actually a cheesecake layer. Now, in my family, instead of cheesecake, we use chèvre. But if you are vegan, you can instead, of course, use an imitation cream cheese. And then I just cream this all together until it makes a nice, smooth cream cheese filling. Now, this is easier if your ingredients are at room temperature, and you will get a better result if you do that also. So here it is, my nice creamy cheesecake or chev cake topping, which I now put on top of my apple mix in my pie crust. And both of them go into the oven for 35 to 45 minutes until my cheesecake topping is set. And I'll see you then for layer number 3. At this point, I had to go run some errands, so I instructed a family member to pull the pie out of the oven when it was done. And they asked me, how do I know when it's done? And in my rush, all I told them was, it's finished cooking when it's firm. Well, I should have been more specific, because cheesecake and pumpkin pie and any of these pies that involves an egg as one of the main ingredients, as a binder, finish cooking after the main part of the cooking is done. And if you pull it out of the oven after it has fully cooked, it will be overcooked because it continues to cook from its own heat. So with these types of pies, you're supposed to pull them out when the very center is no longer liquid, but still has a little give. And that way, when they finish cooling, they will be perfectly cooked. Now, if you look at the pie I made, because I didn't say this, you can see a few things. There's brown spots, and there's a nice big crack in it, all of which indicates that it was overcooked. Not their fault, mine. Now, that just leaves my third layer. And the third layer is actually vanilla pudding. Stop. At this point, I have to give you the biggest, most important tip you have for any type of cooking, and that is read your instructions thoroughly before making it, before making anything, and read them again before you actually start. Twice. First time when you decide to make it, second time right before you start. Because I had not made this in 15 years. And I skimmed the instructions. I did not take the time to read them in depth. And when I skimmed the instructions, I thought, oh, the third layer is a pudding. It is not a pudding. The third layer was supposed to be a flavored whipped topping. Those are two very different things. So I skimmed my instructions, went, oh, it's a pudding. Well, that's an awfully unhealthy way to make a pudding. I can make a more healthy pudding and put it on instead. So, not only did I not read my instructions properly, I changed the recipe to be something else completely different. And that is on me. Now, my guests and those who ate my pie did not know this. They all swore that it was delicious. But every time I watched someone eat this pie, it drove me mad, because by the time they ate it, I realized I had the wrong topping. So I didn't tell them, and everyone assured me that I did tell that it was fine, but I knew better. So read your instructions. Always, always read your instructions. Moving on. There it is. Now, normally I would slice this and taste it and tell you what I think of it, but this is for a party, so it has to wait. But it smells wonderful. Until then, it's going into the refrigerator so that everything can chill and it is served cold. And this brings me to my last tip. If your pie says it is to be served cold, make sure and give yourself enough time for it to chill properly before you have to serve it. I didn't. I didn't read my instructions thoroughly, and as a result, I didn't realize how much time I was going to need to chill it. So it wasn't as cold as it should have been. Certain things didn't set properly, And again, while I was assured that the flavor was fine, I knew the difference. So, if you're going to make a pie that is meant to be chilled, either give yourself a good 5 or 6 hours for that to happen, minimum of 2. And really, if you baked it, that is not enough time. If you have baked your pie and you need to chill it, give yourself 5 or 6 hours and then serve it, or do it the day before and then serve it the next day. It's all part of reading the instructions. And that's the best advice. Just read your instructions. And there we have it. Tips and mistakes to avoid when making a pie. I hope that my misfortune this weekend can help maybe one of you to avoid these mistakes when making your own pies as we head into the summer party season. I love you all, whether new or old. If you enjoyed this or found it the slightest bit helpful, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next week. Until then, whether making party food or anything else, just remember, don't be afraid to suit yourself and make whatever it is you do exclusively you. You know, if you don't want to make your own pie crust, you can buy them. Win. I can't believe I did this.